The news of the expropriation by the communist dictatorship of Nicaragua of the Jesuit University followed the expropriation of 2 colleges, and finally the dissolution of the Jesuits in Nicaragua has gone around the world. I would like to think that this great diffusion of news is not only due to the importance of the Jesuit, because before them there have been other victims of Ortega dictatorship, of Sandinista dictatorship, for example, the nuns of Mother Teresa of Calcutta, and universities, schools, and even church radio stations, diocesan radio stations, have also been expropriated. In the media fuss, the media noise has not been so great. It is true that there has been and there is international interest in the fact that Ortega has Bishop Monsignor Alvarez and several priests in jail. But we are talking about a bishop in jail. I repeat, I would like to think that it is not the fact that they are Jesuits that is the cause of amplitude and the diffusion of this news, because it will be discriminatory with respect to other victims of the dictatorship. And I would like to think this because I believe that there are reasons for it. It is enough to know a little of history of Nicaragua to understand why this news against the Jesuit is especially important. The current dictatorship, the Sandinista dictatorship, presided over by the communist dictator Ortega, it is not the first dictatorship a this Central American country has experienced. Between 1936 and 1979, the Somoza family saga started by Atanasio Somoza and followed by 2 of his sons, the last of whom was also named after him. Anastasio Somoza ruled Nicaragua with an iron fist and with open pockets for all kinds of corruption. To fight against this dictatorship, several forces of every different political sensibilities allied around the Sandinistas, who took the name of a guerrilla leader assassinated precisely by Somoza, and who was somehow the catalyst for the confrontation against the Somoza dictatorship within this struggle against Somoza. An event took place in 1974, 5 years before the end of Somoza dictatorship. In the 1974, the Sandinista occupied the National Palace and took hostage, as there were Sandinistas prisoners in the jails. An exchange of hostage taken by the Sandinistas with the Sandinistas prisoners in the hands of Somocistas was reached. The mediator of this exchange was a bishop, the then Archbishop of Managua, Monsignor Obando. Monsignor Obando managed to get the Sandinista prisoners out of jail, and among them it's Daniel Ortega. Daniel Ortega is therefore free. Perhaps he would have died in jail, thanks to the mediation of the church, when in 1979 Atanasio Somoza Jr. agreed to leave the government and go into exile. By the way, he was assassinated in Argentina a year later. The Sandinists immediately took power, in one way or another, sometimes governing in coalition, or, especially in recent years, governed directly. They maintained hegemony with a brief interval of democracy by maintaining hegemony, control of power in Nicaragua. From the beginning, the church, a part of the church, was allied with them, but not only since the end of Somoza dictatorship in 1979, but also before. In many parishes, there were guerrillas hidden and even weapons hidden. There were many priests and religious who actively joined the guerrillas, and some of them even took up arms against the Somocistas, among them, who must say that there were also Jesuits, and not only Jesuits. When these islands between Sandinistas and the church, or a part of the church, is islands with truncated with the arrival of St. John Paul II to Nicaragua in 1983. Now, 20 years ago, it was one of the most event papal visits, and the image did not allow us to forget the attacks of Sandinismo against the Pope in the tremendous mass in Managua. John Paul II was very clear: you cannot remain a priest and be a minister of communist regime, even at lower levels than that of the ministers, the Pope said. There were several ministers among them. The best known of all was Ernesto Cardinal. Many of these priests preferred to leave the priesthood rather than leave the service to the Sandinista revolution. One of them was Fernando Cardinal, Ernesto Cardinal's brother. Fernando Cardinal was a Jesuit and preferred to leave the Jesuits rather than stop being a Sandinista minister. Left the Jesuits, was suspected of divinis as a priest by the Pope John Paul II, and remained a minister until 1990, when the Sandinista briefly lost power in the democratic election. Later, when they regained power, Fernando did not occupy a ministerial office again, but he continued defending liberation theology, which was being the intellectual and ideological basis with which these priests and religious have supported the Sandinista regime and so many other pro-communist regimes throughout Latin America. Fernando Cardinal, who died in 2016, continued to lecture around the world in favor of liberation theology. Until 2 years before his death, he was lecturing in the United States. It must also be said that in 1997 he had been remitted to the Society of Jesus. Therefore, he died in Managua, and his funeral was held precisely in the Jesuit University in 2016. In the Jesuit University, there has now been sized. I believe that this story tells us what the movement that Ortega has now carried out against the Church, in particular against the Jesuits, is especially important. Ortega, who was freed thanks to the mediation of a bishop, has a bishop in prison. Ortega, who had priest ministers, who had a Jesuit minister, Fernando Cardinal, now has dissolved the Jesuits in Nicaragua. The university, which was so important, at least for the few years, for the diffusion of liberation theology, has now been seized, precisely by those who benefited from the liberation of theology to come to power. And in the meantime, what has happened to the Catholic people in Nicaragua? From the beginning, an overwhelming majority of over 80%, they are now, they said, 45%, equal to the very large group of Protestant sects. If they have not already been surprised by them, a nuncio in Central America country was right when he told the bishops of that country, quote, "You have made a choice for the poor, and the poor have made a choice for the sects." Wouldn't it be more the moment of seriously rethinking, also from the intellectual point of view, the consequences of the support of a very important sector of the Church for liberation theology for communists? Why? Not because liberation theology is still as important as it was then, but because liberation theology is the mother. It is the root of what is now called theology of the people. and which is at the base of the German Synod, and in some way, at least in a sector of these two who are influencing the next Synod of bishops, because it is the so-called theology of the people, which say that there is a new sources of revelation, which is public opinion. Public opinion will be the new sources of revelation together with the word and tradition. And even if there is an opposition with both above them, that theology of the people, which is, I repeat, now trying to manage the church and change at least its sexual morality, but also other things. That theology of the people is nothing more than the heir, let us say, an evolution of that theology of liberation. Wouldn't it be the moment to analyze the consequences of the church support to a communist ideology, and to analyze the consequence of the church support to the daughter of that ideology, of that theology, the support communists? The someone who was released from prison by a bishop has a bishop in prison? The someone who had a Jesuit as a minister dissolves the Jesuit in his country, that he takes over the university where that minister has his funeral and where he was a very important professor for so many years, should be a reason for reflection. It can be said once again that the revolution to borders is parents and many times also its children. It can be said that from the dust comes this mud. If we do not make an examination of conscience, if we don't make an attempt to honestly analyze why we have come to this, the massive loss of the faithful in so many countries, where religious and priests supported the communist regimes in good faith, if we do not make an examination of this, unfortunately, it seems to me that we will be doomed to repeat the same history over and over again. A history now no longer has liberation theology by the hand, at least as it did then, but has by the hand of the other of liberation theology, which is the so-called theology of the people. Until next week, God willing.